Chapter 12 Nightfall on the Remarkables. Jack was the first one to wake the next morning. The sun had just begun to rise behind the mountains, and he suddenly remembered their day's quest. They were going to scale the Remarkables. It was overwhelming, but scary, but exciting, but nerve-wracking. There were so many different emotions racing through Jack's mind that he thought his heavy breathing might wake the others. He was not set on believing that nothing resided at the top of the mountain. It had to be one of the few places humans never ventured, but then for all he knew, there could have been a hidden village of snow people living up there, so he really had no idea. Quietly and slowly, Jack crept past his two sleeping friends and ventured outside of the cave to take in their next part of the journey. The Remarkables were enormous. It was amazing how he hadn't noticed them when they ran out the day previous. Must have been low clouds, he said quietly to himself. At first glance, they did not look inviting at all. They were practically at a 90-degree angle going up, and from what Jack could see, there was no path in sight. If only Jack's father could see him now. There's no way on earth that he would let Jack get this close to the Remarkables, but here he stood. In the back of his mind, there was some guilt about lying to his father about where they had gone, but then at the same time, they hadn't reached where they said they were going, so technically, was it a lie? He shook the thought out of his mind, looking around and realizing he was completely on his own. Jack pulled out his weapon and that he had taken from the cave. The long silver blade shone bright in the rising sunlight. Jack began swinging it at imaginary enemies and stabbing the blade in the things that were not there. It had suddenly dawned on Jack that Emma had not yet taught him any of her training that she said she would do. To be fair, he thought, we have been travelling ever since we met. And he carried on swinging his sword around the air. Since Jack was waving his new weapon around, he hadn't noticed Emma wake up and was now watching him with an ear-to-ear smile on her face. Not bad for someone who's never handled themselves before, she shouted from the cave, which made Jacob wake up suddenly. With the abrupt noise coming from the cave, Jack dropped his sword and fell over what appeared to be nothing. Emma laughed even more, but soon walked out to join him. Here, she said, smiling as she held out her hand for him to pull himself up with. Jack got to his feet and picked the sword off the ground. You've got a really good sword there, Jack, said Emma, positioning herself opposite him. Show me how you use it. Jack's eyes widened. What? He said sheepishly. Fight me, Emma said simply. There was yelling coming from the cave. It was Jacob cheering Jack on. Go on, Jack, he exclaimed. You got this. Emma pulled out her old sword and tossed it to the side as she drew out her small yet sharp dagger from the cave. That does not make Jack feel any more confident at all. I'll go easy on you, she said, still smiling. Jack was trying so hard to think what to do. He thought back to the trolls and how he went for its legs simply by swinging. Jack knew that he had no great skills in hand-on-hand combat, so he tried yelling and waving his sword at Emma, only to have her block him with a simple raise of her dagger. Jack tried again, but went to attack her legs, but Emma was quicker and blocked that too. Attempt after attempt, Emma was much too quick for Jack, blocking and defending his every move. Move your feet, shouted Jacob from the sideline. Jack started almost hopping immediately and had to admit that this felt a lot more natural rather than standing still like a tree. Good, good, said Emma, still smiling. Try not to shout so much either when you charge. That way you have the split-second advantage on me. Right, said Jack. After several minutes of combat, Jack was steadily improving. He was moving much faster than he was when she started, but it was a great improvement nonetheless. The sound of the blades clanging against each other was becoming a lot more frequent now, to the point where Emma put her dagger away and went back to her old sword. Let's see you face me with this thing, she said. Don't be afraid, Jack, shouted Jacob. You can do it. Strike her. Jack nodded to Jacob and started to hop again in a circular motion around Emma. The swords were colliding more often now than not, and both Jack and Emma were working up a sweat. You're doing great, Jack, shouted Jacob. Jack had to admit that Emma was an amazing fighter. The way she moved with her sword like it was almost part of her arm, and that she'd been doing this for years. More collisions between blades had Jacob clapping his hands and cheering like crazy, until Jack suddenly temporarily lost his footing, managed to trip up Emma from the side, and then falling down onto her back. Trying to act as though this was deliberate, Jack pointed the tip of his blade at Emma's throat as he breathed heavily. "Yes!" shouted Jacob as he ran to the others. "Victory! Victory!" he repeated at the top of his voice. "What happened there?" Emma asked, laughing. "I took you out with my leg," Jack said firmly. "More like you tripped and took me out accidentally," she said. Jack joined in with Emma's laughter, and then he helped her back onto her feet. The three of them walked back toward the cave, looking forward to some more of Jacob's sandwiches. "How was that?" asked Jack, who was eager to know what she thought. "In all honesty," Emma started, "it was very good. You learned that it's much more easier to defeat someone if you're moving. Come at them from any angle possible. There are no rules when it comes to combat like that. If your enemy is set on destroying you, then he will." "Did you learn just by doing it on your own?" asked Jack. "Yeah, mostly. Just picked up the odd tips here and there and adapted them to my own way. Here's one for you. If they're an experienced fighter, then they're going to be blocking everything you throw at them. Just as you just saw, the legs are a great weak spot. If you can slice the legs in any spot, it will wound them, even if it's brief and it distracts them for a moment. That could be the second you make your attack. You had me, and if we're properly fighting, I'd be dead." "That was still pretty fun, though, wasn't it?" asked Jack, who could not hide his level of excitement. "The excitement will wear off when there's 10,000 enemies coming towards you," said Emma bluntly. "But that day is not today," said Jacob, steering the conversation away from battles and wars. "Who's hungry for breakfast?" "Yes," they both said together. The three of them ate a decent chunk of the sandwiches because of what lay ahead of them. They needed to be fully rested and fully fed, and now it all felt like they were ready to embark out of the cave and begin the hike up to the Remarkables. "Remember," said Emma, "it won't be completed in a day, so don't moan that it's taking ages." "I'm ready," said Jacob, tapping his new axe. "Let's do this," said Jack, gripping the handle of his thin sword. With one look back at the dark cave, the three of them set off side by side and headed towards the Remarkables. No one said anything for several minutes once their journey had begun. Jack thought they were all thinking of what could be living up there in the snow. Or maybe Emma was thinking of where they could head once the mountains were completed. Jack couldn't see that far into his plans. He was still thinking about what it would be like to climb the mountains. They had banked on a path of some kind leading them the way, but what if there was no such path? What if it was like another labyrinth of razor-sharp rocks? And if there was a path, would there only be one? If so, whatever might live at the top of the mountain must know that path better than any of them. It would be a great mission to try hide from something up there. "I'm glad it's not raining today," said Jacob out of nowhere. "Yeah, I was just thinking that," said Emma. "Trying to battle your way through sludgy snow is a nightmare." "Done it before, have you?" asked Emma, waiting for some outrageous story. "My dad did," he said. "I don't think it was the Remarkables, but I definitely remember a story he told me about trying to get through waist-deep and wet snow." "I can't imagine it being much fun," said Jack. More silence fell among the group before they all knew it, they were virtually on the edge of the Remarkables. One more step and the climb would begin. "Should we just climb right here?" asked Jack. "Hey," Emma shouted, "look at that over there." To Jack's amazement, there was a dirt path, which quickly turned into a stone path, leading up into the mountains. It was only slightly to the left of where they stood, and now was so thankful that Emma had spotted it. She ran over to the path to see if it looked promising. When she spoke, her voice was hesitant. "It's a path, and it definitely goes into the mountains." "Okay, great, let's go," said Jacob, coming to join her. "But look at this." Emma raised her right arm and pointed at what looked like a skeleton laying on the ground. "Oh my God," said Jacob, who was not ready for such a thing. "Oh," said Jack, backing away. "Guys, it's either this or we try and climb it ourselves." "We have to," said Emma. Jack shook his head quickly to shake the image of the skeleton out of his mind. "She's right. Come on, guys. We have a mountain to climb." And to everyone's astonishment, including his own, Jack led the group past the pile of bones and began to trek into the mountain range. The passageway itself was enough to make the hairs on Jack's neck stand up. Jack walked through a great opening that reminded him of some great getaway. Almost instantly, the passage began to slope upwards towards the tip of the mountain, but the three of them kept moving. They figured that if they were to stop, they would never want to carry on. The path's surface was still flat, at least, but was still battering. Like the cave, there were rocks coming from either side of the stone walls, as well as the massive boulders protruding out from the ground itself. "This is going to be hard," said Jacob as he nearly slipped on some loose stones. "Maybe it'll get easier the further we go," said Jack, not looking behind him. "What are the odds?" said Jacob. Thinking back to the idea of creatures living on the mountain, there was no way they would be able to hide from them if the path kept going the way it was. The three of them could barely move without making a sound, let alone hide from vicious mountain beasts. Just when this seemed to be the worst plan yet, Jack looked on ahead and saw that the path was becoming flat again. Still rocky and terrifying, but at least it was flat. "Oh, thank God," said Jacob as he caught up with Jack. "Don't get too excited yet," said Jack. "Look at that." And just like Emma did, he raised his arm and pointed on ahead at the path. It had turned into another cliff and became very narrow. "Do not go quickly, okay?" asked Emma, who had seen what was in front of them. "I don't care if we're on here for a week, as long as we all get to the other side safely." The path was not as narrow as the cave, and they did not have to glue themselves to the wall, but still, the more they passed on, the higher the drop became. "What are we going to do when nightfall comes?" asked Jacob. "Are we just going to pitch the tent on the path?" "Well, obviously," said Emma, "if there's nowhere for us to take cover, then I suppose we'll have to." "Try not to think about that right now," said Jack firmly. "Let's worry about that when the sun starts to set. We'll still have a short while before then." All three of them started moving rather quickly than before. It was obvious they all wanted off this deadly passage as fast as possible. It wasn't too long before Jack noticed that the temperature had slowly began to drop. Without saying anything to Jack or Emma, he looked up to see if the top looked any closer. To his surprise, the top of the mountain still seemed like another day's hike, but the snow was getting gradually closer and closer with every step. Jack looked down at what he had on, and his stomach dropped as he saw just a pair of shorts with a thick coat on. Looking back at his friends, he saw that they didn't have much more than he did. Jack did not want him and his friends to freeze to death. The cliff started to curve to the right and still slowly creeping towards the sky. How long would it be before the others noticed that they were approaching the snow? Jack was racking his brains trying to decipher a plan ready for when the question came. But from looking around, there wasn't much to go on. He just hoped and prayed that there might be some sort of opening for them to hide in overnight, or even for the path to be slightly wider for the tent when the time came to put it up. What was much too soon for Jack's liking, Jacob spoke out the words that he did not want to hear. "Has anyone else felt like it got colder all of a sudden?" he asked, looking around. "Yes, I have," said Emma slowly. "I've been wondering that too." "It's the snow," said Jack. "The more we go on, the closer we get to the snow. Can the tent be made if it's on 4 feet of snow?" "Only one way to find out, I guess. Depending on what comes first," said Emma, looking up at the snow. "If the snow comes first, then I think we should pitch the tent just before it gets too deep to move. And if the darkness comes first, then like we said, we'll just make the tent before we can't see anything." "Yeah, okay. Sounds good," said Jacob, slightly shivering. "Let's keep going," said Jack. Try to get as far as we can." Walking in single file once more and trying not to look down, Jack couldn't help but grip the handle of his sword whilst they were moving. How much of a miracle would it be if their presence went unnoticed? After seeing the bones, it was clear to Jack that something must be hiding somewhere in the mountains. What it was, he had no idea, and he hoped he would never find out. The cliff began to become increasingly steeper now, which could only mean that the snow and more cold was slowly greeting them. Rocks and boulders were still main obstacles that they had to watch out for, and once the sun went down, there was no way they would see anything in front of them. Everyone was shivering now, and Jack was fairly certain they all wanted to stop and put the tent up, but they also knew it would be best to carry on until they had no choice. Then there was a sound that broke the silence and made everyone's hearts pound. A boulder had come plummeting from above them and smashed beyond them into 1,000 pieces. All three of them froze. "Where did that come from?" asked Jacob through chattering teeth. "Up there," said Jack slowly. He tried to look and see if he could find the source of what did it, but no such luck. "Do you think someone knows we're here?" asked Jacob, sounding frightened. "Possibly," said Jack quietly, still looking up. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as though it was bursting to come out. Come on, let's keep going. Emma nodded and followed Jack round the curving path and caught up until she was right behind him. The drop over the cliff was now an uncomfortable height for anyone to look down, which did not help calm anyone. Jack was moving as quietly as he could when he suddenly heard sounds. Distant sounds, but still loud enough for him and Emma to stop dead in their tracks. Do you hear that? He asked in a hushed whisper. Emma nodded. Jacob came in and saw the others had halted. What's up? He asked quietly. I hear something, Jack said, still looking dead straight up the straight path. All three of them started listening hard to see if they could identify the noises they were hearing. Emma was quickest and soon realized was what she was hearing. It was someone eating. Someone's eating something, she said, almost inaudible. Jack froze with fear and thoughts of what to do next. There was a big enough boulder up ahead for them all to take cover behind. With a jerk of his head, Jack dashed as quickly and silently as possible and beckoned the other two to follow him. Without being noticed, the others made it behind the boulder. The crunching sounds of someone eating could still be heard, but were slightly more audible. They were closer to it now. Jacob, being the tallest, peered out from behind the rock to try and have a glance at what was making the sounds. Didn't take long for his mouth to drop and retreat back behind the boulder. What is it? Jack and Emma asked together. It's a goblicon. Just one. Jack didn't say anything, but instead kept looking at Jacob with puzzled looks. A what? He asked. A goblicon, asked Emma. Are you sure? And there's only one? That I can see, yes, said Jacob. And yes, I'm pretty sure it's a goblicon. I can make out the light green skin. Jack's head was darting backwards and forwards between Jacob and Emma. Hello? Someone tell me what a goblicon is. It's a species of goblin, said Jacob. Normal goblins live in dark caves and are often in large groups. Goblicons, if you can imagine it, are more evil and sneaky. They also group together, but not in large masses like normal goblins do. A species of goblin? Jack asked, sounding shocked. Are you serious? Completely, said Jacob, peering out from behind the rock. So what do we do? Asked Emma, sounding scared. You say they stay in small groups, Jacob? Asked Jack seriously. Yeah, most of the time they do. They've been known to venture off on their own, from which the looks of it, this one has done. Otherwise, the others would be eating too, you'd think. Right, said Jack quickly. So when you say small groups, how small exactly? Well, if you're unlucky enough to come across normal goblins, they can be up into the hundreds, but goblicons, though, they only like to be around 10 at the most. 10? Asked Emma, in a tone of disbelief. Remember, they're evil and sneaky, said Jacob. You'll only want 10. Okay, so again, what do we do? She asked. Emma, exclaimed Jack in a loud whisper. Your bow and arrow. Can you try and aim for him? Maybe if you hit him in a good spot, he'll die instantly and not scream. Yes, Jack, that's a great idea, said Jacob, smiling. Easy for you to say, Jacob, said Emma, frowning slightly. You're not the one firing the arrow. Just do what you can, said Jacob encouragingly. Emma gave a great sigh and, with her eyes closed, swung her bow and arrow from behind her back, shot out from behind the rock, and fired her first ever arrow. The shot was not perfect in taking out the creature in one quick movement, but it did cause the goblicon to fall to the ground. The creature was yelling and rolling around on the stones. Jack, without thinking, darted from behind the rock, drew his sword out, and stabbed the goblicon before it had time to draw another breath. We should move quickly, said Jack, looking around. Others might have heard that. Wasting no time, the other two followed Jack quickly behind him, hoping to make a quick getaway. Unfortunately, their attack did not go unnoticed. Shortly after the three of them made a run for it, more screeches and cries could be heard up ahead. Before they had time to think what to do next, 7 more goblicons came hurrying around the corner off the cliff to see what the noise was. They were small creatures, only half the size of Jack in height, and they had light green, rough skin, along with bright red eyes, sharp gold teeth, long fingers, and each of them were carrying the same weapon, which were maces. A sharp metal club with spikes coming out of the end of it. Jack's eyes met the goblicon leading the pack, and they stared into each other's for what felt like several moments before the leader of the goblicon pack gave a harsh cry to the sky. Suddenly, all the small creatures were charging towards Jack, Emma, and Jacob. They didn't waste any time. Altogether, all three of them charged back into the Goblicon horde. Jack had his sword out, and he was like before Emma saw him, and like he was before Emma saw him, swinging in all sorts of different directions. Emma had her old sword still, and she too was waving it in the air, but she was hitting targets perfectly. Jacob had his new axe, and he was hacking away at Goblicons left, right, and centre. The Goblicons had certainly misjudged Jack, Emma, and Jacob. Within minutes, it was over. All coming to and realizing it was done, Jack, Jacob, and Emma all stared at each other. Jack slid his sword back into his belt and began wiping his hands on a nearby rock. "Good stuff, you guys," said Jacob, panting. "Jack, really well done," said Emma. "Thanks," he said simply. "We should keep moving, just enough to get away from this. The sun will be down soon. We should put up the tent before it's dark." Jack turned away from Jacob and Emma and began walking on. Several more minutes of silent walking went on until Jack spoke and decided that they should pitch the tent now. The others agreed. It was not the best place for them to sleep, but it was that or try conquer the Remarkables in the dead of night. "Fire?" asked Jacob. "I'm lighting one," said Emma without looking at the other two. "I'm not freezing to death in my sleep." "Yeah, good idea. Light a fire, but what do you say we don't make it huge?" said Jack. "Don't want to draw too much attention to us any more than we have." "I think if you find one plank of wood, then you're doing great," said Jacob, looking around the passageway. "All I see is stones and boulders. Nothing to burn." "Yeah, that's true. All I see is stone too." "Okay then. You two get inside the tent and stay as warm as you can. I'll stay out here for a bit and keep watch outside." "Wake me in 2 hours, Jack," said Jacob. "Then you can rest and I'll take watch." "Thanks." The tent was up and the sun was fully set now. Jack sat on the edge of the tent while Jacob and Emma peacefully slept away. It was amazingly cold, but Jack was determined to hold out the rest of his watch duty. It was impossible to fall asleep in this cold. Whenever he dozed off, his shivering would wake him up again. Just as he began to wish he had never offered to keep watch, Jacob came out of the tent. "Hey, Jack, thanks for doing that," he said. "You can go inside and rest now. Don't worry about swapping back. I'll go till sunrise." "Are you sure?" asked Jack, shocked. "We've still got a long way to go on this mountain. No sleep can't be good for that." Jacob waved his hand across Jack to cut him off. "It's no problem for me. I couldn't really sleep anyway. You go lie down inside. I can hear your teeth clanking together. I'll be all right. I've got my flute." And on that note, he pulled the small wooden flute of his backpack and began playing a different melody that Jack had never heard before. "That's not the Moon and the Owl, is it?" he asked. "No, this one's one of my favourites. But now is not the time for childhood tales of mine. Go get some sleep, and I'll see you in the morning. I'll wake you both at first light. Promise." Jack nodded once more and retreated inside the tent, took the spot where Jacob had been lying previous, right across from Emma. Almost instantly, when Jack hit the pillow, his eyes began to slowly droop shut again until the last thing he heard was the sound of Jacob's tuneful flute filling the tent in the night sky. Thoughts of goblicons and dragons were quickly taken out of his mind as Jack fell into a dreamless sleep to await what would come next for the group.